Good afternoon, everybody. This is Matt from the Greene County Historical Society, and this is our first week of the Greene County Historical Society and Bowlby Library Book Club. So this week we read about the very early history of Greene County. This was our first foray into that, and as such, there are a few things that I really want to expand upon this week. The first few articles we read about were the early inhabitants of the county, with a slight emphasis on the Native American inhabitants. During the 1870s, when the articles that we've read were written, there was very little known about the early Native American inhabitants in this area. It was commonly thought, and still is to this day to a degree, that when European settlers first arrived here, there were no Native Americans. That actually is largely true. There weren't entirely no Native Americans here. We did have the Shawnee, the Iroquois, Delaware, and a few other groups that were traveling through the area, but in the mid-18th century, when this area began to be settled, there really weren't Native Americans permanently living here. So, I'd like to give an overview of the prehistory of this area. Prehistory being everything that happened before recorded history, and we'll go over a few artifacts that we have here that relate directly to that, and I'll explain a little bit about how we know some of these things. So, the prehistory of Greene County, Pennsylvania begins at least 13,000 years ago. Many of you guys may have heard of Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, which is in Washington County, not too far from Avella. That has been scientifically proven to be one of the oldest inhabited sites in the country. In fact, there is radiocarbon evidence there that suggests that people could have been living there as long as 17,000 years ago. Now, depending on who you speak to, that number may be contested, and here is why. For many years, it was largely agreed upon that the first group of Native Americans to inhabit this hemisphere were the Clovis people. It was thought that they crossed the Bering Strait land bridge that opened up during the Ice Age, when the sea levels dropped, and they came into this continent from Asia and settled, and eventually populated the entire hemisphere. That, within the last decade, maybe two, has become a debated topic. There are several sites in the country now that suggest that there was migration here before the land bridge opened up on the Bering Strait. It's thought that people were actually traveling by boat and going up the coast of Asia and coming down the western coast of what's now the United States, and all the way down to the very tip of South America. In fact, one of the oldest archaeological sites in this hemisphere is the very southern tip of South America, and it has radiocarbon dates that suggest activity back, I believe, as long as 20,000 years ago. So we don't know much about these very early people from pre-Clovis times. We do believe that they were here. That's become a fairly widely accepted theory. We do know a little bit more about the Clovis people. The Clovis people, they're called that because they were identified as a cultural group at a site in a town called Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. And the Clovis people can be identified by a very specific type of projectile point that they used, arrowhead that we would call in normal usage, but they're identified by that. And after this segment, we're actually going to look at a Clovis point from my personal collection. Unfortunately, we don't have any good examples at the Greene County Historical Society Museum of Clovis projectile points. We have one very small one, which we will also see. There have been Clovis points recovered in Greene County, however. So we do know that Clovis people were here as early as 13,000 years ago. So, in fact, we have several Clovis sites in the county, most of which actually are in the West Greene area, around Rich Hill Township, and that area are where most of the activity we know of was with Clovis people. We also know of some Clovis activity around the village of Brave, Jefferson, and Greensboro. But it seems like the largest concentration of sites that have been discovered is in the Rich Hill Township area. So the Clovis people were a true hunter-gatherer culture. They did not settle in one place. They covered very, very large territories of land. They would travel, hunt, and primarily they hunted large megafauna that's now extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, the really, really, really big game that lived here up until about 10,500 years ago, give or take. Depending on what sources you look at, the numbers vary a little bit. So the Clovis people, their cultural traits tend to be consistent throughout the entire country. But again, all we really see of them is what was left behind. And in a period as long as it's been since the Clovis people existed, all that's really left are mostly stone tools, occasional bone items, and things like that. Again, we have no evidence showing that Clovis people ever settled in one place. They tended to travel very extensively and widely, possibly thousands and thousands of miles in their hunting cycles. And that's what we know about the Clovis people. Again, they were the first group to travel through this area. And they existed, they show up in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago. And I don't want to say they disappear, but we stopped seeing the typical Clovis technology around 10,000 years ago. And what we believe happens is with the disappearance of the large megafauna, the Clovis people, they had to change their hunting strategies, which in turn caused the change in the tools they left behind in the archaeological record. So around 10,000 years ago, we stopped seeing the beautiful Clovis points, and we actually start seeing a large array of different kinds of points in very widely varying designs and styles that probably served very different purposes for the user and maker of them. And this transition between the Clovis period and what's actually known as the Archaic period, again, happens 10,000 years ago. You may hear me use the term Paleo-Indians. That's actually the term that's applied to people that lived in Clovis times, and the groups that started to develop around the end of Clovis times leading up to the Archaic period. Once we get into the Archaic period, again, we see a very wide range of tools start to develop. Projectile point technology changes very much, and again, projectile points are what we would commonly call arrowheads. Flint tools, that begins to change a lot. We start to see stem points, and again, after this segment, we'll actually look at some of these points, and we'll see how they develop over time. And we will be looking at points that have been found in Greene County, Pennsylvania. So we get into Archaic times, and really, in the beginning of Archaic times, not much has changed as far as the Native American way of life went, as far as what we can tell from the archaeological record. There's still a hunter-gatherer society, still not settled, still traveling a lot, and still very much living off the land. So we have a several thousand-year stretch of time that covers the Archaic period. What we start to see at the end of the Archaic period, not just here in Greene County, but throughout the country, is at the end of the Archaic period around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, we start seeing small settlements crop up. Very, very rare to find them. But we do start to see the indications of at least seasonally based settlement. And we also see the areas that people travel in start to get smaller and more regional. People might be spending all of their time hunting and living in an area that might consist of, say, the entire upper Ohio Valley region, as opposed to an area as large as what several states would be today. So, specifically in Greene County, at the end of the Archaic period, we start to see a little bit of agriculture develop. Now, that's not agriculture in the term of large farms with, fields and fields of crops. What you would have seen at that time at the end of the Archaic period is going to be smaller patch crops. Think more along the lines of what a home garden would be like now. You might have a family, an extended family that's planting a small group of things to sustain them. Large-scale agriculture doesn't come until much later. Actually, roughly about 1,000 years ago. Another interesting development we see in the Archaic period, and this begins much earlier in the Archaic period, we start to see the beginnings of the development of stone axes and woodworking tools. And this kind of shows us that they were maybe building structures, they were certainly modifying their landscape, and again, we do know at the very end of the Archaic period, we are starting to see these permanent settlements. So around 2,000 years ago, we transitioned from the Archaic period into what's known as the Woodland period. And specifically in Greene County, Pennsylvania, the Woodland period can be broken down into 3 very, very specific and distinct subgroups. The early Woodland period is very much defined by a group known as the Adena culture. And if anyone's familiar with Moundsville, West Virginia, and the Grave Creek Burial Mound, that's one of the largest Adena burial mounds in the United States, actually one of the largest man-made mounds in the world, and that was created by the Adena culture. It's believed that the Grave Creek Mound was built sometime around 250 BC, give or take. So, believe it or not, we actually have several Adena burial mounds in Greene County, Pennsylvania. The most noteworthy ones are on the Crow Farm in Richland Township, and there are several others that have been identified and studied in Greene County. And I won't give away the locations of any of these sites. They are protected archaeological sites, but they do exist in the county. And very likely there were many Adena burial mounds in Greene County. What tends to happen is in the early 1800s and late 18th century, when people began settling here, when Europeans began settling here, many of them would have likely been destroyed by plowing. Our mounds here in Greene County, most of them would not have been anywhere near as large as the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia. Most of them here in this area would have been on the much smaller side, likely 5, maybe 10 feet high originally, and 20 to 30 feet in diameter. And even the ones that exist now are much smaller compared to their original sizes. And again, that's because of things like erosion, agriculture, and just the passage of time. We see a lot of Adena presence in Greene County. Adena points, which we'll see an example of an Adena projectile point after this segment, are commonly found here. And one of the interesting things that we begin to see happen with the Adena culture is we see the beginnings of trade. Now, again, the Adena were really the first group of Native Americans in this area that had what could be defined as a permanent settlement. Now, their settlements, they may not have lived there all year long. They may have had summer camps, winter camps, but generally speaking, they're living in the same areas, they're using the same sites over and over again, and there does seem to be a focus in their communities on their mound complexes. Again, Greene County does not have major mound complexes, but we do have mounds, and generally where there's mounds, there's usually Adena settlements somewhere nearby. We also start to see the first archaeological evidence of ceremonial activity in the Adena culture. Excavations in the larger mounds have shown items that can only be described as ceremonial objects, or objects that start to show the indication of religious beliefs and practices. However, we do see indications of specific funerary practices much earlier on throughout the Archaic period. But by the Adena times, it does seem to have developed into what we could probably say is a proper, well-developed religious system. Unfortunately, we know very little of what their beliefs were. We can only make assumptions based on the archaeological record. The next period after the Adena culture lasted, again, depending on what sources you look at and what specific area you're in, the dates can vary widely. But with the Adena period, we're looking at about 1500 BC to 300-400 BC, and the Adena culture sort of transitions into what's the Hopewell culture. We would also call that the Middle Woodland period. The Hopewell culture is a very exciting time in Native American archaeology. We see an explosion of ceremonial sites, ceremonial activity, sites that seem to be dedicated to some ceremonial purposes. We also see an increase in true agriculture and more long-term permanent settlements. Now, as far as the Hopewell cultural group itself goes, we actually see very little of that in Greene County. It seems the Hopewell times in this area were more an extension of the Adena culture. Now, that's not to say that the Adena people and the the Hopewell culture were two different groups of people. For a long time, that's what was believed, but it actually seems that it was more of a transitional phase with the same cultural group or groups from one idea system into a more complex system. So we're not seeing a change in people, we're seeing a change in ideas and beliefs. The Hopewell culture in the Middle Woodland period is very exciting for the specific reason that we start to see expansive trade networks throughout the entire continent, specifically between the Rocky Mountains and the East Coast, through Canada, and even into the Gulf Coast. We see major trade. We see copper from the Great Lakes coming into the Ohio and Upper Ohio Valley regions. We see mica from the Carolinas coming into the Upper Ohio Valley region. And incidentally, I mentioned the Upper Ohio Valley region does encompass the Monongahela Valley region. We are considered part of that Upper Ohio Valley region. We see conch shells from the Gulf Coast finding their way into the Ohio and Upper Ohio Valley regions. So we know that people were traveling, people were trading, and we know they were not just trading goods and material items. We know that this Hopewell cultural interaction sphere, as it's called, is exchanging ideas as well throughout the entire continent. We start to see similar ceremonial items and evidence of similar religious beliefs all over the country. And we still see a continued use of mounds through the Hopewell period as well. Adena mounds tended to be more burial mounds, whereas Hopewell mounds tend to be more of a remembrance of a specific site. Most Hopewell mounds are actually buried on top of, or created on top of building sites. It appears as though that they are edifying ceremonial sites that are no longer in use. We see what appears to be crematory basins underneath them, and structures that seem to have the indication as being charnel houses or places where they kept the dead. And we do see the beginning, or I don't want to say the beginnings of, but we do see indications of strong ceremonial activity. And if anybody ever wants to travel once the country's back to normal and the COVID-19 pandemic is behind us, I would strongly recommend going to Newark, Ohio and Chillicothe, Ohio, and seeing some of the large Hopewell sites in those areas. They're remarkably impressive. So at the end of the Hopewell period, we transition into the late woodland period, and Greene County actually has a very specific group that's unique to just our area and parts of Fayette, Somerset, Washington counties and the adjacent areas in West Virginia and Ohio. And they're called the Monongahela culture. The Monongahela culture is a very interesting group. They're true agriculturists. They were living in permanent settlements. They were farming large sections of land. We see them using the same burial sites for extended periods of time, centuries. And the Monongahela culture was actually the last group of Native Americans that we know permanently lived in this region. So we don't really know where the Monongahela culture came from, whether they were a new group of ideas that came out of the Adena and Hopewell groups, or whether they were a people that came from somewhere else and settled here. We really don't know their origin stories. What we do know is they start to show up in the archaeological records around 900 AD, so about 1100 years ago. And in the very beginnings, what we see of the Monongahela culture are, we see unfortified settlements that can either be on ridgelines or in bottomland near a water source. Now, after about 100 or 200 years, we actually begin to see Monongahela culture villages being fortified. And actually, after this segment, I will show you guys an artist's rendering of what a fortified Monongahela village would have looked like. So, again, about 200 years, about not even that long necessarily, about 1050 to 1100 AD, we start seeing these Monongahela village sites being fortified. So what that would seem to indicate is that there is a population increase, that we're seeing several groups living in the same region that are likely competing for resources. So the fortification is probably a way for that specific village, that specific extended family group to protect their resources from other people who may try to take it by force if necessary. We don't really see any specific instances of warfare between groups in this area that I'm aware of, but there was definitely a need to protect themselves. There are many hundreds, if not thousands, of Monongahela village sites in Greene County, and nearly every water system in the county is lined and dotted with village sites. Many have been discovered, many are still undiscovered. And a few of the notable sites in Greene County would be the Throckmorton Farm site and the Foley site. And we see interesting things happening in those sites. In fact, things that typically only happen in Greene County. We see these large circular villages with palisade walls outside, with a central building that's called a pedal structure. And what a pedal structure is, it's a circular building that has these leaf-like appendages on it, and we don't really know what they were used for. And if looked at from above, a pedal structure looks very much like a daisy. And if I can find an image of what a pedal structure looks like, I'll include it in this video so you guys can see an example of what those look like. But they're very interesting, and we don't really know what their true purpose was. We don't know if perhaps it was the place where the local leader lived, and the pedal structures were maybe storage areas, or if it was a communal site, perhaps a ceremonial site. We really just don't know. And there are only a few examples of them. I believe there are actually 4 known examples of pedal structures, most if not all of which are actually within Greene County, Pennsylvania. And again, in a lot of these Monongahela Village sites, we actually see continued usage over several centuries. Now, as I had mentioned, Monongahela Cultural Group was the last group of people to live permanently in Greene County that we're aware of. The later Shawnee and Iroquois and Delaware, we think were probably just hunting here, perhaps living here in small groups, but not in widespread settlement. It really looks like they were mostly just traveling through the area and hunting. That's really what we're seeing. There's possibility there could have been larger permanent settlements here. We just don't see that in the archaeological or historical records. But nothing's ever out of the question when it comes to history. Every time we think we know something, we begin to learn new things, and that's what makes things exciting. So, the Monongahela group, they seem to disappear very abruptly in the archaeological record around the year 1635. And we really don't know why that happens. There are 2 very strong theories, one of which is we do know that the Monongahela group was never in direct contact with Europeans, but we do know that they were getting trade goods from Europeans via a trade network. In Greene County specifically, we start seeing trade copper, even a couple instances of iron tools in the Monongahela people, and lots of trade beads. And again, I'll actually put some pictures here of some of those items that we have in our collection here. So the first theory of what happened to the Monongahela people is they may have died out from disease that they contracted via indirect trade with Europeans. And it's also thought that they may have been having military conflict with the Iroquois and some other groups at the time. There are a few very interesting but very vague accounts in Jesuit records of people that were traveling through this area that seem to hint at war with the Iroquois, but it's not specific enough that we can even identify the group the Jesuits are talking about as the Monongahela people. But there are some pretty interesting indications that seem to suggest that. Myself personally, I think it was probably a combination of the 2. I have been lucky enough to have the chance to study many artifact collections that relate to the Monongahela culture, and speak with a lot of archaeologists that have actually studied Monongahela remains. And it does seem to indicate there was a disease component and a military component. We actually have records of Monongahela people who have suffered physical attacks on their bodies. So myself personally, I believe it was somewhat a combination of the 2. And after the Monongahela culture sort of disappears from the record, we really don't see much else until the early settlement time. So again, we're really thinking that there weren't too many Native Americans in this area between 1635 and the 1750s, 60s, when there starts to be extensive white settlement. So I'm going to close this section of the video. Okay, we are back, and as I promised, we're actually going to look at some artifacts that relate to the things that we just talked about. As I mentioned, I was going to show you guys a Clovis point that was from my personal collection. This is it here. This is about 3.5 inches long, and if you notice it, when you look at it, it looks like a spear point, and that's exactly what it would have been. One of the specific defining features of Clovis points, and it's very difficult to see here, but it's actually fluted. And what that means, it means that there is when it was made, the flint knapper took a strike from the base and left a groove going right up the center on each side. And what that does is it allows it to actually be attached to the spear shaft much more easily and much more strongly. Now, this specific Clovis point did not originate in Greene County. Actually, it came from the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. And this actually would be very similar to what we would find here. In fact, we might even see the same type of stone used to make it. Typically, as far as Native American cultures go, what we find here in Greene County tends to be more similar to what we find in Ohio as opposed to what we would find in, say, eastern Pennsylvania. So this is a Clovis point, and this was made by the hands of man roughly 13,000 years ago. And as I had mentioned, when we transition into the Archaic period, we actually start to see projectile points change. These are Archaic points right here, and as you notice, they're actually slightly smaller and much more elaborate in their design. And again, this is probably a result of the extinction of the megafauna like mastodons and mammoths, and a result of how they had to change their hunting techniques to adapt to an ever-changing world. And I had mentioned that during the Archaic period, we also start to see the advent of stone axes. This is actually an extremely beautiful stone axe. As you can see, it's very, very finely made, and this likely dates to the early or middle Archaic period, so it's possibly as old as 7,000 or 8,000 years, probably as young as 4,000 to 5,000 years, and same thing with these points. Now, all of these items, and in fact the rest of the items we're going to see in this short section, actually were found and located in Greene County, Pennsylvania. So, as I had mentioned, after the Archaic period, that's when we transition into the woodland period. Now, right here, these are 3 woodland artifacts. And what we have is we have a very, very nice example of an Adena spear point. We've got a small Adena pipe. And this is called a gorget. And what we believe these were used for is actually to protect the neck. Like if you were in battle to prevent something sharp from maybe cutting your neck, something like that. That's what we believe those were for. Very rare to find, but there are several nice examples out there. Now, on to the Monongahela culture, which was what we discussed the most in our last video. We'll start with what some Monongahela culture projectile points look like. Now, you'll notice these are much, much smaller than what we see in previous time periods. And one of the specific reasons for that is when we get into that time period, roughly about 1,000 years ago, that's actually when we start to see a bow and arrow in the archaeological record. Prior to that, everything was done with a spear or an atlatl, but when we start seeing these smaller triangular points, we know that people are using proper bows and arrows. Up here, actually, we have a little bit of corn. This is charred corn remnants that were actually found from a Monongahela village site. And one of the things that I didn't mention that sort of happens at the same time agriculture begins to develop is that's when we start seeing pottery. When we're conducting agriculture, we're staying in the same place and we start to have excess food supplies that we have to store. So pottery was invented as a way to store our excess food and made settling in one place much, 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 much easier. And lastly, we'll look at some Monongahela trade artifacts. Now, again, these were all found in Greene County, Pennsylvania, and most of the items we see here are copper, and all trade copper, not native copper. And, you know, this would have been stuff that the Monongahela people traded with other groups that was eventually coming from Europeans. And we actually have a few examples in our collection, we don't have them out here, that are clearly fittings from trunks. But they were found in Monongahela Village sites, so we know that they're trading with Europeans. And we've also got some very, very fine and beautiful trade beads. These you know, see in the later periods of the Monongahela culture. It doesn't seem that the Mon were trading with Europeans for too much of their existence, probably 20, 30 years. So if we find European goods on a Mon site, we know it's a late Mon site. And that's what we've got. And thank you for joining us. Bye. Thank you for joining us for week 1 of our joint reading club with Eva K. Bowlby Public Library and the Greene County Historical Society. Our reading assignments for next week will be on page 9, Miss Christina 6, An Authentic Tradition, page 27, The Warpath, page 29, The Spicer Massacre, page 31, Miss Elizabeth Bozarth, and page 33, Colonel William Crawford. And next week in our video, we'll be getting a lot more into Greene County. This next section is going to deal largely with Indian massacres and attack and the very early years of settlement. And in our video, we'll be talking about not only the massacres and attacks that are in our reading assignments for the week, but we'll also be talking about a few others that have been missed by a lot of the local histories that we've uncovered through research and other information, one of which is actually very special to me. It involves my family and an attack made on them on April 23rd, 1789. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.